His name was Eric Jameson, and he saved Stragview from the riot of 2017. Eric Jameson, Officer Jameson, was probably the nicest guy you'd ever meet. He was a career officer, a man who'd forgotten more about corrections than most of us had ever known. His appearance was vaguely Chinese, or maybe Korean. He always wore his hair in one of those buns, his widow's peak never touching the thick gray mane on the top. He always reminded me of Uncle Iroh from Avatar, and the way he spoke and carried himself was very reminiscent of the character. I got to work with him on my first night flying solo on the compound, and it was an experience I wouldn't trade for anything. When you walked with him through the quad, it was as though the clouds lifted away from the sun. Inmates smiled more. Officers were less surly. Everyone was just in a better mood when Jameson was around. He was personable, remembering inmates' names and asking about their troubles. He passed 5 times as much time in the quad as any other officer I'd ever known, a practice that would have gotten anyone but Jameson dragged into the investigator's office under speculation of inmate collusion. Jameson did the same to his fellow officers, though, and I never saw anyone snap or take a surly tone with Jameson. He was knowledgeable, sharing his wisdom willingly, and the way he walked amongst his charges was utterly devoid of fear or care. He walked through the quad as though it were his home, and the inmates were no more than his neighbors, whom he was greeting on his way home from work. This was not a skill he had gained from years of experience, though. Jameson had a way about him, that was undeniable. Jameson had a vibration about him that broke up tension. It was an ability you had to see firsthand. It was an ability I actually got to see firsthand. About a year after I started with the department, we had a significant disturbance in F Dorm. What had started as a skirmish between rival gangs had developed into a fight that threatened to bathe the whole quad in blood. It all came to a head at lunchtime. The 2 gangs had taken advantage of the other inmates leaving and took the opportunity to privately air their grievances. We were all poised to roll into the dorm with force. Blood and weapons were already present in the quad when Jameson stepped into the corridor. The captain had just finished up a blistering speech designed to prep us for the coming scuffle when Jameson walked through the door and stepped inside. 20 or so men looked at him, their faces covered in a veneer of readiness, and their resolve melted away before we could take a single step towards the door. He spoke to the 2 groups for less than a minute before both were ready to end the hostilities and submit to the officers in the hallway. Jameson came out of the quad with a peaceful smile stretched across his old young face. "They're ready to comply, Captain," he said, his voice like a gentle river. That was when I felt it. It was like someone hit a tuning fork. You can feel it vibrate through your skin, in your teeth, in your gray matter as it washes over you. This was like that, except it was more like a gentle wind chime or a soft temple bell. I saw it wash over the others in the hall as well, and a general atmosphere of calm permeated everyone. Even the captain, who had been ready to spit nails when Jameson had walked onto the quad, smiled and clapped the grandfatherly fellow on the shoulder as he admonished him for his efforts. I saw Jameson later as he came out of the area next to the captain's office that held the snack machines, and I asked him about it. He just smiled. "Oh, just years of know-how. It's all about knowing how to say and when to say it. You'll pick it up, little brother." I shook my head, my body wanting to smile and agree with him as his proximity made me feel easy again. "No, I mean, the thing that happened when you talked in the hallway. I heard a kind of a chime?" I tried lamely. I couldn't properly describe the emotion because it wasn't something I'd ever felt before. The others seemed to accept it, almost seemed to welcome the feeling of ease that wafted around Jameson like a fog. I, on the other hand, wanted some answers. I wasn't one to just accept things as they were, and I hoped this was something he was aware of. If it wasn't, I was about to sound very crazy to someone that I respected. Jameson smiled, chuckling a little in the face of my confusion. "You're a little more pragmatic than the others, I see. Yes, I suppose you'd call it a tone. Since I was young, I've had it. A kind of aura that creates peaceful feelings in those around me. It's a gift I often use around here. I was astonished. You mean you have this gift for bringing peace to those around you, and you use it in a prison? He took a chip from the bag and chewed it speculatively, as though thinking about how he would answer the question. When I was 13, I thought I might use the ability to become a diplomat or a politician. If I could bring peace to those around me, I could be an asset to those in trying situations. I soon realized, though, that positions like that were out of the reach of my less-than-rich family. I thought then about training to be an actor, someone who could affect change by the nature of celebrity. That was another path that was closed to me, however. The climate at that time was not kind to Asian immigrants, even those not hailing from Japan. I then considered the army. Maybe I could do some good as an officer, and someone with my skill set would be useful on the battlefield. The Vietnam War was raging, and it was far better to enlist than to be drafted. I joined and served my time, but I never made it onto the battlefield. Instead, I was sent to a Navy vessel and told to cook, something I was good at. I slung hash for the next 8 years and retired with a pension and an unfulfilled ideal. As he told me his tale, I could almost imagine the younger man he had been. He had been full of ideas and hopes, just like me, and he felt dissatisfied by the world at large. He had a talent, but the world didn't see fit to use that talent. Sometimes it seems like the world makes things harder for itself. I confided in an officer while aboard the USS Copeland that I had a gift for making people calm. He laughed until I proved it by calming a group of tired flightmen who were milling about the landing zone. They went from scowling and mumbling to smiling and going about their task with purpose within a second of me talking to them. He asked how this could be possible, and I told him about my strange aura. The officer, however, told me it might be best to keep this ability to myself. I would likely be thrown out as a loony, or worse, kept in a lab somewhere and experimented on by people who believed me. He sighed and seemed to stare off into space, reliving his glory days. So there I was, 26, unemployed, and looking for the next place to use my talents. I considered a career in medicine, but I didn't have the memory or the stomach for it. I considered law enforcement, but my academy scores were never good enough to qualify. Corrections, on the other hand, decided that they would take me gladly. That was back in '76, and a man with no family and an open schedule can find all sorts of work in this department. I signed on with Stragview, and I've been here for nearly 30 years. Yeah, but why? I cut in. Jameson looked across the yard, taking in the dorms and the chain link, and seemed to miss it already. Did you know that while I've been here, uses of force have declined by 45% from the year previous to my hiring? When I'm on shift, the need for physical force is at an all-time low. This prison sits on a nexus, son. I'm sure you've noticed some strange things around here. As he said it, his eyes twinkled a little in the moonlight. Thinking back on it, I had indeed seen some strange things within the walls of Stragview. Sometimes, some unexplainable things. If my presence here can cause even one officer to leave in his car as opposed to in an ambulance, then my time here has been well spent. I do not consider my talents squandered. Quite the contrary. I think this is where they might be best served. I always found that profound when I looked back on it. I did, before that night at least. 6 months ago, Officer Jameson told me that he was retiring. I was working inside at this point. The captain liked to have me on his yard team, and I liked being a part of it. I was going to pick up his count slips when he gave me the good news. Next month will mark my 30 years of service with the department. After 30 years, I think I might be ready for some much overdue rest. I asked him how he meant to spend his retirement, and he told me about a piece of property he owned with a fish pond and a hunting lease. He intended to hunt, to fish, to care for his garden, and maybe even write his memoirs about his time in the war and his time with DOC. He seemed happy when he spoke about these things, and I was happy for him. He seemed pleased at the prospect of rest, and I wished him joy of his newfound freedom. By the end of the month, he was gone, and we settled into life without Jameson at Stagview Prison. When I arrived at work the next day, the change was immediate. The air around Stagview had always been heavy. The place seemed almost Lovecraftian at times, and an air of oppression seemed to roll in with the fog most mornings. Today, though, it seemed different. It felt like it might rain at any minute, and it was the first time I had ever thought about just climbing back into my truck and driving home. We used force that night. It was the ugly kind of force, the kind you use on desperate men. His name was Daffin, and it all started because he was hungry. Like many inmates, Daffin decided to sneak a second tray from the food line. Officer Wilde stopped him on the way through the chow hall and told him to give up the tray. Inmate Daffin explained that he had paid for this extra tray, not uncommon in prison economics, but Wilde was hearing none of it. He snatched the tray and told Daffin to take his ass to his table and not to treat him like some rookie. Daffin responded by punching Officer Wilde in the face. Officer Wilde responded by breaking his jaw and nearly kicking off the first chow hall riot I had ever seen. We got them calmed down, and Daffin went to the infirmary while Wilde went home. I had seen violence on the compound before, but this was the closest I'd ever seen to it coming off the rails. Tensions remained high for the rest of the night, but I would soon discover that the chow hall incident was just an overture. The week after that, the outbreak started. The previous week had been hard. 4 stabbings, 3 fights, 3 assaults on staff, and 2 attempted suicides had made it the longest week I could remember. Daffin had gone to the hospital in the midst of it, his jaw re-breaking when he tried to break up one of the fights. And when they called me in on Monday, my first day off, I was not happy. I wasn't alone though. Most of my shift was called in to lock down 2 of our open bay dorms. Daffin had come back from the hospital with something, and it was spreading like wildfire. We were never sure if it was the flu or what exactly it was, but it made them cough and snot and acted more like pneumonia than anything. After the 5th inmate had been rushed to the hospital, they put another dorm on lockdown. After the first death, they put nearly all the dorms on lockdown. The only 2 dorms not on lockdown by the end of the month were H and F. This was only because they were under too high a custody to get close to the infected inmates, which worked against them this time. They became responsible for cooking the meals, packed in styrofoam, and trucked down to the dorms. These were men with no experience in the kitchen, and as the quality of the food began to slip, the quarantine dorms began to make more and more noise. We were living in a powder keg, and a single spark would be all it would take to blow us all to kingdom come. That spark came on the night of the riot. I had just got on shift when the call about a fight came down. 2 officers from the previous shift were sent to help the dorm officer quell the disturbance. After I got my equipment, I headed that way to see if they needed help. When the siren went off, I knew something terrible had gone down. I could see the doors of the dorm, and the inmates were pressed against them as the maglocks held them in place. The officers in the station had been quick enough to engage the security locks, and I could see Creast glancing over his shoulder as he shunted an inmate away from the dorm. You could hear the blatting siren from halfway across the world, so when we got the word that F dorm was in an uproar, we weren't terribly surprised. When they came boiling out of the side doors like angry cockroaches, that did surprise us a little. We'd been suited up for a breach, preparing to enter the side doors of H dorm and rescue a wounded officer. The 6 of us were preparing to enter when a mob of howling inmates came spilling down the lawn. We would later find out that they had somehow gained access to the station and took the door off its lockdown. At that moment, though, all we could do was fall back for the gate and try to quell the tide. We spent the better part of the night holding the center gate. The inmates would push to the gate, attempt to rush us, and fall back after we put a few of them down. Killing isn't something you know you can do until you've had to do it, and the sight of these men sprawled out on the grass still haunts me a little. Our usual team, a 6-man group that joked and laughed through our weekly drills, were not toting empty guns tonight. Every weapon had lethal ammunition, and our goal seemed to be more than the usual rescue the CO and quell the inmates scenario. We had put down another 6 when someone came to relieve another officer named Hardy and I. The 2 of us were taken to the warden's office, where he sat drinking tea as though this were just another day. The warden looked well put together for someone awake in the dead of night. His pinstripes were immaculate, his salt and pepper hair was uniform, and his gold-rimmed glasses were polished to a high gloss. He smiled at us, wolfishly, as we entered, and the smile was wide and toothy. I suddenly had a bad feeling that we were about to be called upon to do something not altogether legal. I didn't like the warden much. I had only seen him a few times, and every time he had made my stomach turn over. During my interview, as the assistant warden and the captain of my prospective shift had asked me questions, he had just sat there, staring at me. His eyes were predatory, calculating, and it was easy to imagine that he could see right through you as his eyes bore into your very soul. He had interrupted the assistant warden mid-question to tell him that I had the job, and it had taken everything in my power to reach across and shake that hand. Now I wish I'd never taken the job. "I need you boys to go on a little errand for me," he said, glancing over the rim of his cup like a mischievous cat. I almost fancied that his eyes changed as he spoke. He gave us directions and sent us out in a state van. As I rode shotgun, I wasn't happy about what we'd been told to do. The warden wanted us to go to an address and pick up a CO who would help us with our current situation. The CO in question was known to all of us. He had been on our shift until just last month. The general tremors around the compound have changed drastically since he left. We need a man of his talents back at work where he belongs, the warden had said. We were going to roust Jameson from his much-deserved rest. The whole trip I felt very conflicted about this little errand. Jameson had earned the right to his rest, and we were going to drag him back to a place he had only recently escaped. Sometimes I joked with certain inmates that I had another 27 years before my release date, and I was doing a 30-year stint myself. This made me wonder if, at the end of the day, would they be free to pull me back too? I didn't like the idea of that. We pulled up in front of the house around 3 a.m. and found him waiting on the front porch. He had put his uniform back on, his hair scooped into its typical warrior's knot, and he looked utterly at peace. I could feel his tone when I climbed out of the van, a calming breeze that blew across my face. But as we approached, I began to feel a strangeness amongst the notes, a discord that pervaded the tone. He was presenting it for us, but was far from committed to the feeling. "Sergeant Hardy, to what do I owe the pleasure of your company so early in the morning?" Hardy paused for a moment and pressed on. "I assume that you know, dressed as you are. I think you were waiting for us, maybe." Jameson nodded placidly. "Maybe. Maybe I woke up and sensed that my gifts were needed. Regardless, I am ready." He sat in the back, and I chose to sit with him as Hardy drove. I felt less and less sure about this errand the longer it went on. It almost felt like we were escorting this man to his incarceration, if not his execution. He sat smiling, looking straight ahead as Hardy drove, and I found myself staring at him with ill ease. He turned his smiling eyes to me, and my unease deepened. He looked like a man whose mind is at peace with his own death. "What's on your mind, son?" he asked. I shook my head. I just don't feel good about what we're doing. It feels wrong. Suddenly I was assaulted by his calming aura, and it washed over me like a warm bath. "All will be fine. All is as it should be." He gripped my hand and squeezed, and I felt at peace all the way back to the compound. We arrived to find the National Guard vehicles in the parking lot. They had finally arrived, it seemed, and were preparing to go inside and gain control. We rolled through the front gate onto the compound, taking Jameson in through the front gate entrance. He climbed out of the back, looking around with a sense of homecoming, and we made our way to the center gate. Jameson floated between us, the picture of composure, but those jangles were still present amongst the calming aura he exuded. We led him, Hardy and I on either side of him, but it was he who truly led us. When we approached the line at the gate, the captain nodded at Jameson. His look was full of something, but at the time I couldn't place it. Jameson patted his shoulder and stepped towards the mass of inmates keeping a muddled perimeter near the gate, just outside of shotgun range. "Jameson, what are you doing?" I called out, stepping towards him. "They'll tear you apart." The captain stopped me with an outstretched hand. "Let him work. This ain't his first rodeo." The inmates noticed him and began to move towards him like a swarm of angry bees. He didn't falter in his course, never wavered, but as he neared, I felt him reach out with that odd tone and give them the full brunt of his power. They charged him, raising clubs and shanks, but staggered as they came within 10 feet of the man. They began to sway, began to fall, and as I watched, they all fell on their faces in the grass and placed their hands behind their backs. They fell like cordwood, weapons spilling from limp fingers as they lay smiling on the grass in placid compliance. It was at that moment that I understood the terrifying extent of Jameson's power. It was then that I understood why he had never been allowed to be a general, or a politician, or a diplomat, or anything more than a minder of the dregs of society. Had Jameson been a very different man, he could have used his power to devastating effects. There was no way that a just and loving God would have allowed a man to be tested so, without corruption. We spent the next hour putting zip cuffs on inmates as Jameson moved across the compound. We couldn't take him into the dorms, of course. We couldn't risk such a weapon in the confined space behind the doors, but it seemed we didn't have to. Just his presence on the yard quelled much of the riots, and we began to receive reports of inmates throwing down their weapons and returning to compliance. As Jameson walked, order began to reassert itself. As Jameson went, so peace went in his wake. He saved us from the riot that would have taken days to quell. He saved hundreds of lives. And how did we repay him? We were on the rec yard when it happened. We had cuffed them and were processing inmates on the yard as they tried to regain some normalcy. We identified the instigators, threw the others back in their dorm, and the light of dawn was just beginning to peek above the horizon. The warden had come out with an armed escort and was overseeing the operation with the captain, Hardy, and myself. Jameson was continuing to calm the situation, his tone stretching out like an ocean wave, and when he ambled over to our group, he was haggard but smiling. It had taken something out of him to use it, and he looked ready to drop. The warden extended a hand to Jameson, and he looked at it hesitantly before he shook it. "Excellent work, Jameson. We've missed your little gift around here. How would you like to come back? I can see that you're promoted, move to admin shift, and put you up somewhere cozy." Jameson smiled, but shook his head. "I do not think so, sir. I'm willing to lend my gift now and again, but I've found that I quite like retirement." The warden feigned a look of regret. "I was afraid you'd say that." The captain's shotgun stock cracked against the back of Jameson's head, and he fell face first onto the grass. I had my gun slung around and pointed at them before I could stop myself. The captain swung the barrel of his shotgun around to cover me, but the warden shoved it away and stepped between my gun barrel and the group. His eyes did that funny thing again, where they shifted to something almost cat-like. He didn't look angry or afraid, but was instead curious as he studied me with his strange eyes. "You know what must be done. If he leaves the compound, it will descend back into chaos. So, he mustn't be allowed to leave. You know this is the best thing for the prison. A little sacrifice for the good of us all." I pointed the gun at them, wanting to pull the trigger. If I did, though, I'd have to pull it on myself next. I'd known what would happen here. Hadn't I felt it at the beginning? The gun held firm for a count of 10, the warden standing between us, the captain looking nervous, Hardy's eyes darting for the best course of escape. Eventually, I dropped my gun barrel and let it hang underneath my arm. The warden said to grab him, so we did. We took him through the rec office and down a flight of stairs I had never seen before. We came to a door, a big ugly metal thing that opened onto a shadowy corridor that seemed to stretch into the earth. It was lit by a small island of light created by overhead lights in small round cages. As we walked, a chorus of the damned yelled from the doors. They wanted food, they wanted freedom, they wanted death, they wanted to see the sun. We ignored them, and many shrank away when they saw that the warden was with us. We deposited Jameson into one of those cells. He lay on the floor, breathing shallowly, and I paused at the door to look at him. Were we really about to do this? Were we really going to doom a man to spend his days in this dark hole? Would his gift even reach out from this hellish place? As the door swung shut, I both hoped it would and prayed that it wouldn't. That was a month ago, and the prison has never been more peaceful. In the wake of the riot, we returned to the same semblance of peace, much like the days before the quarantine. But I know the truth. I've thought about quitting 1,000 times, thought about putting my gun in my mouth and ending it all, but I always worried that I too might wake up in that lightless void beneath the prison. So let us never forget Officer Jameson, the savior of our compound. May his death come swiftly and release him from the hell he now resides in. May it be enough to grant him the freedom he deserves. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thanks so much for joining me for tonight's story. Looks like we've taken another trip back to Stragview, and not a very nice one either. Stragview is a place that we will come back to many times, and it's a place that many of you will find dark and uncomfortable. I do apologize for showing you some of its darker bits today, but Stragview is a place that must be explored, like many dark places in our world. Let's go ahead and thank our patrons before we sign off for the night. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Xaronana for being our Ghostly Reader contributor. And thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks everyone. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you too can have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. Patrons also get their videos a day early, so what are you waiting for? Come get your spooky on a Tuesday and a Thursday. If you're as intrigued by Stragview as I always have been, might I suggest the book, Stragview Stories, available on Amazon. You can go ahead and read ahead, and there are some stories in there that aren't available in my other books, so get your copy today. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.